Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'm going to continue the Vienna series with the Stanley variation, the move bishop c4, a very aggressive move that resembles the bishop's opening a lot, and we are going to be seeing some transpositions from the Vienna to the bishop's opening and vice versa when I cover the bishop's opening. Okay, so what is this move about? Well, it's aiming to develop the bishop to a very natural attacking square, looking at f7 before playing d3. Since the knight is on c3, white will have a very hard time playing c3, d4. So we want to go d3, and then we want to go either knight e2 with f4, or knight e2 without f4, or knight f3 in some cases. Black has several options. Now, the most straightforward way to fight against this is the so-called Frankenstein-Dracula Variation, which simply goes knight takes e4, and this is by far the sharpest line. So it's a temporary knight sacrifice. The knight is going to be regained if taken. I should say the knight cannot be taken because of the common trick with d5. And we get very sharp lines where white is starting a kingside attack very early on. And still, I think this is black's best and most straightforward attempt. So this is the first way to play against the Stanley variation. The second most popular way to play is actually going knight c6. And now we are transposing into the bishop's opening. This is called the bishop's Vienna hybrid, and basically it's going to depend on what they do from now on, but we are somewhere in between the bishop's opening and the Vienna, and it's a very natural move, playing against d4, defending e5, preparing to develop, and most importantly threatening to win the bishop on c4 to get the bishop pair. Since this is white's most active piece, and it's looking at f7, why not punish white? The bishop doesn't really have too many squares to go to. So knight c6 is very natural and a good, safe way for black to play. It's not the critical way to play, but it's safe. We have two more options and two more moves we are going to be looking at. One of them is the so-called reversed Roy Lopez, or the reversed Spanish, where black goes bishop to b4. And you can see the similarity between e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. It's basically the same thing, although you don't see black too often playing bishop to c5 in the normal Spanish. So this simply aims to put pressure down this diagonal and weaken the e4 pawn, and basically black will aim to disrupt this harmony in white center by doubling the pawns and forcing something like dc3, and then playing for a strategic, long-term strategic advantage in theory. And finally, we're going to be looking at what I think is probably the most interesting attempt. It definitely leads to some extremely sharp and crazy lines where both sides sacrifice material. There is a forced draw in which white gives up a rook and more that starts after this, and that's the move bishop c5. This is the so-called Spielmann attack, named after Rudolf Spielmann. It's an extremely interesting way to play, because if we look at black's pieces, they are harmoniously placed to put pressure on f2, and the f2 square is actually where white is weakest at the moment because of neglecting kingside development. So because white hasn't played knight f3 and castles, f2 is much weaker than usual. Okay, so these are the four moves we're going to be looking at in great detail. Before I go into the theory, I would like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Chessbook. Chessbook is a tool that makes learning openings extremely easy, and it's easy to understand and easy to use, which I always find very important because I'm a grandmother for computers. So what does it do? Well, you import your repertoire into Chessbook. You either do it like I did it, like I went here, white, more options, import, and I've just imported the full PGN on the Stanley variation of the Vienna, which we are looking at right now. So now that's my white repertoire. Or you can do it by hand. Let's say I go black, browse, edit something else, and let's say I want to add something I do against the reti. Against the reti, I go d5, they go g3, I go knight f6, they go bishop g2, I go bishop f5, they go c4, I go c6, and so on and so on. I can do it by hand like this, save this to my repertoire, or I can do it by importing a PGN of the entire study of an opening. So if you would like to get the study for the Stanley variation of the Vienna and visit Chessbook, you can find the links in the description. So once you've imported your repertoire, either by hand or from a PGN, you can do two things. The first thing is you can practice the moves from that repertoire. So you go practice moves. Let's say I want to practice everything that's due for review. Why this? Okay, this for some reason the Spanish is over here. But okay, let's focus on the Vienna Stanley variation. In this case, we can go D3 or we can go F4. So let's say D3. In this case, we can go F4. That's one of the moves, and so on and so on. It can quiz me on all 205 moves. I'm not going to get all of them correct. So the mistakes I make, it's going to focus on that, and it's going to quiz me on those next until I learn my repertoire properly. The second thing you do, you connect your Lichess and Chess.com online accounts to Chessbook in a second, and then it finds mistakes from your games based on your repertoire. Now, I've connected a training account on Lichess, but I don't have any Vienna games in it, so it found no mistakes naturally. But when you import your actual repertoire and when you connect your actual accounts, you can basically practice only the mistakes you've made. So that's, I think, the best part of it if you're an online player. This is the basic version. It allows you to import a couple of hundred moves, which I'm using it right now, so it's obviously enough to do something. But the premium version gives you unlimited moves. It's about $5 a month, and I would recommend that you get that if you want to study your openings seriously. Once again, you can find the link to Chessbook in the description below, as well as the link to the full study on the Vienna. You can download it, import it, practice it, and make watching the video and learning the opening much easier. On my Patreon page, you can also find studies to many different openings. It doesn't just have to be the Vienna. Thank you very much. Back to the video. Okay, let's start with the Frankenstein-Dracula variation. So it has a funny name, and I have no idea why it was named so, but it's definitely sharp, so it deserves a crazy name like that. Black takes on e4. Now, we should say that there are two fairly obvious moves for white that simply don't work. If you're looking at this position, you're probably wondering why not knight takes e4 or bishop takes f7. Well, knight e4 runs into d5, and after d5, bishop d3, d4, bishop e4, there's f5, and black is definitely better. This is -1. Black has extremely good central control. The other knight can safely be transferred to f6, and black isn't risking anything. This bishop is going to be moving around the board a lot. For example, if bishop f3, we can simply go bishop d6, or we can even go e4. So that's why knight e4 doesn't work. So we don't take. So you may be wondering, why not bishop takes f7, regaining a pawn before doing that so that you don't get forked? Well, there's an issue there too. If bishop takes f7, then of course king takes. And after knight takes e4, the most natural move is definitely correct, d5. Black is about -1 according to the engine. This huge central control is just too much for white to handle. Black will have a ton of space and not such a hard time developing. For example, after the knight moves, we go bishop d6, rook f8, and king g8. It's not like white can do that much damage. In the meantime, after, for example, knight c3, we can continue c6, saving our pawn. White goes, let's say, d3, knight d7, the knight's coming to f6. If queen h5 check, we can go g6. Basically, black's center compensates for the misplaced king, and of course the bishop pair. So black has the bishop pair and a huge center that really cannot be disrupted. So what does white do? Well, black had taken a pawn, and there is only one way to fight this Dracula variation. You go queen h5. It's fairly simple. You threaten mate in 1. Knight f6, of course, isn't possible because you just checkmate on f7. And black has to save the knight. Black has to defend checkmate. So knight d6 is the move, and the variation goes on from there. I would just like to show you one very common mistake after which white is better, almost winning, and that's knight g5. After knight g5, seemingly defending f7, well, you're not because of d4. And after d4, if you, for example, take the pawn, then white takes on g5 and is threatening the queen and mate, and that's completely losing. So black has to play knight e6, defending mate, and after d5, pawn up for white. Well, not a pawn up, white had regained one of the pawns, but this pressure is way too much for black to handle. This is losing for black. We can of course imagine something like f4, f5 coming down the board very quickly. Black's pieces have no natural squares and white has a huge lead in development. So white goes queen h5, black goes knight d6. And now white has a choice. Either retreat the bishop or take the pawn with check. If you take the pawn with check, the queens get traded off. So that's definitely not optimal. You're trying to attack. You played bishop c4 and you played queen h5. You want to put pressure on black. If you take on e5, it's going to be equal. Queen e7, you have to take, bishop e7, then you have to save your bishop. Then maybe knight f5 comes, knight f3, c6 d5 by black. This is possible. It's not worse for white, but it's definitely not an attempt for an advantage. And white has to move the knight, has to play c3, d4 just to equalize, has to transfer the bishop to c2. So for example, knight e2, let's say rook e8, c3, knight d7, the other knight comes to f6, bishop c2, knight f8 defending the knight, d4, and it's complete symmetry. It's nothing. If you want to draw, then fine. After knight d6, you can take on e5 with check, get your pawn back, and have a completely symmetrical position. So we don't do that. Here's what we do. We go bishop b3. We want to keep this pressure on f7. This bishop is our only active piece for now. Fine, the c3 knight has some squares and will be able to jump into the game, but this bishop is the monster. Okay, black plays bishop e7. Prepares to develop and castle, and we go knight f3. Now playing e4 isn't possible because we can take it. The knight defends e4 and f7, so knight f3 comes with zero downside. By the way, white can opt to take on e5 as well here because there's no queen trade, but again, it's not too good. If we take on e5 here, then castles, something like d4, knight c6, queen f4, maybe knight a5. As soon as white loses this bishop, it's over. There is no attack. And again, it's going to be a symmetrical position. So after bishop e7, knight f3. Again, there is no downside. And now the most natural move for black leads to such an interesting position, which could get black mated in a couple of moves. Black, I think, should continue knight c6. That's the correct way to play. But I'm going to show you what happens after castles. If black castles, you start attacking with pawn to h4. Now, this may not seem like much, but it's not about advancing your pawn. It's about giving your knight the g5 square. And having your knight on g5, of course, threatens mate on h7. Okay, so either g6 or h6 is going to have to be played. But as soon as you play something like h6, there's a hook you can undermine with moves like g4, g5. And according to the engine, this is completely sound. It's equal, but if you had to choose, who in their right mind would ever choose to play black here? Okay, so after h4, if g6 is played, for example, then queen takes e5. Okay, now it's fine. Knight c6 and something like queen f4. Let's say rook e8. We don't have to castle, we can keep our rook here, so king d1 or king f1 is a very natural attacking position. Knight a5 can be played, and they do snap the bishop up, but we're going to play h5, and it's going to be interesting. So g6, I think, is a good attempt, just forcing the queen to take on e5. If black doesn't do that, let's say knight c6, then we jump in with knight g5. Okay, now in this position, if the knight is taken, black simply loses. So if bishop takes g5, that's game over. H takes g5, pressure on h7, so h6 is forced. We take on h6. Again, now we're threatening to take and checkmate, so queen f6 is forced. Hg7, queen g7, and we just go d3 and black resigns. After bishop h6 there will be no salvation. Of course queen g6 check is also hanging, and the black queen just has no squares. The engine gives this as +7 and knight e8 as the best move. If you play rook e8, then bishop h6 is mate in 6 after queen takes g2. I mean, if, for example, queen h8, then queen g4 check, and you can see that this is game over. If king h7, then just move the bishop, and that's it. So if knight c6 is played and not chasing the queen away straight away, then knight g5. And of course, taking the knight loses. What if h6? h6 is actually okay for black, but we can now go queen g6 using the pin. Of course, if the knight is taken, we win, because, I mean, if the knight is taken with the pawn, then it's just going to be checkmate. But after queen g6, if bishop g5, then we get this position. Queen g5 is forced, of course. We trade, ag5, and we have long-term pressure down the h-file. For the moment, white has given up a couple of pawns. The engine says it's equal, but after something like d3, we're going to get one pawn back, and we're going to have long-term pressure on the king. So I think this is extremely nice. The engine says -0.2. So definitely not enough even for half a pawn, let alone 2 pawns. White's pieces are just too active. So after knight f3, if they castle, we go h4. Extremely interesting. If they go knight c6, as I said, which is a better move, now we don't go h4 because their king isn't committed yet. We just take on e5. I think that's the best move. And after g6, which tries to defend f7, now there's too much pressure. We take on c6. This is the so-called Alekhine variation. D takes c6 and queen f3. And again, white has some pressure. It's nothing major, but eventually we may be able to go h4, h5. We don't have to castle kingside, although we can. If we do, we switch plans, of course. Let's say knight f5, d3, 2 good bishops, and a pleasant position. Definitely a slightly better structure. Let's say knight d4, queen d1, rook e8, rook e1, knight takes, pawn takes. It's an okay position. So taking on e4 for black, if white knows what they're doing, could lead to extreme problems for black. But if black knows what they're doing too, then it's going to be roughly equal. Same as all Vienna variations in which both sides play well. White isn't playing for a big advantage with 2 knight c3. That's just the way it is. It's not the most active move. Okay, now let's continue by looking at what you could call the main lines, but definitely not just the Vienna. Now we are in bishop's opening territory. This is called the Vienna hybrid, so we definitely have to pay attention to it, but it's not the critical way to play. White goes d3. That was the whole idea behind bishop c4. In the bishop's opening and in the Vienna, you want to do something before you move your f3 knight. And there are 2 ways for black to play. Black either gets rid of this bishop or doesn't. If black doesn't take the bishop straight away with knight a5, then white's plan is going to be to go f4 and probably f5. Okay, we want to put pressure down the king side. If black chooses to take the bishop, then we switch plans. Okay, let's look at taking the bishop first, because that's the most sensible way to play. If knight a5, we don't waste time on moving the bishop back. We go knight e2. Okay, they take, we take. We have control over d5, and our pawn structure is actually pretty good. We're going to go b3, securing our pawn. Our bishop goes to e3, and we castle kingside. This is very, very pleasant. You can then later on continue with f4 or with f3 if you want to keep things solid. Look at this as a sort of Maroczy bind for white, where everything is solid and the light squared bishop has been traded off. So if you want to find the positives here, it's a Maroczy bind without a light squared bishop, which is ideal. Okay, bishop c5 castles. Normal. d6, queen d3. Looking to save the pawn, looking to play bishop e3. bishop e6, b3, saving the pawn, let's say castles, let's say bishop e3, maybe knight d7, trying to play f5. It's clear that white doesn't have anything major, but for the moment we have d5, which is a very useful square. If c6 is ever played, then d6 is of course weak. And both sides would like to play either f4 or f5. In this position, f4 can be played already. You can also switch plans and go knight g3, f4, f5. You can go queen d2 and go f4. You can take on c5. Let's say we play queen d2, supporting the f4 square. Now, f5 straight away by black is okay. It's a very natural pawn break. White can continue f4, and I think something like this should happen. We should get a position in which both sides have played f4 and f5, and there's this slight imbalance that white has doubled c pawns and the d5 square. And again, it should be equal, but I think white has a slightly more pleasant position. So that's what happens if black decides to take the bishop pair. Long term, of course, in any endgame, black is going to be better, so white doesn't want to trade pieces. Instead of knight a5, which is what I would call long-term plan for black, you take the bishop, you induce a structural weakness, and you want an endgame. Instead of that, black can play more concretely with either bishop b4 or bishop c5. These are the two alternatives. And in both cases, white is going to want to play f4 and use the fact that this bishop is still on the board. So let's look at bishop b4 first. Knight e2, once again, this is our move, we're going to go f4. Black plays d5 because the knight is pinned, fine, that's the idea behind bishop b4. E d5, knight d5, and castles. Now the knight had unpinned, black plays bishop e6, and we take bishop d5, bishop d5, and f4. So in this position after castles, we don't continue f takes e. That would give us nothing. We continue f5. And the idea is white would like to go f6 and provoke black into playing g6. So black has to play f6. And now we play for the e4 square. We go knight g3. Black, let's say, saves the bishop, but doesn't have to. And now knight c4. And this is the start of a very nice attacking game, I believe. Firstly, because we have the idea of going h4, h5, h6. Secondly, we have the idea of going g4, g5. And if you can imagine something like king h1, bishop e3, rook g1, the knight moves away g4, this pawn can be used as a great attacking force. So I don't think bishop b4 is such a great attempt for black. Bishop c5 is a bit more interesting, but we again get the similar type of game by white. White goes f4, and after f4 it's clear that white's the one attacking. It's also clear that white isn't castling kingside anytime soon unless this bishop disappears, but it may disappear. d6, we always have to pay attention to these two moves, grabbing the bishops, and unless they go a6 or a3, that could happen. So knight f3, let's say bishop g4, and now I think white should use the opportunity to snap this bishop off and castle kingside, because we managed to play f4 before knight f3 and black has to move the knight in order to play f5. It's obvious that f5 is the most logical pawn break for black. So when it comes to pawn breaks, white is ahead. So why not castle and have a normal position with the bishop pair? So knight a4. The bishop drops back to b6, we take it, a takes and castles. And now again, this is nothing huge, and there's a clear downside to this, but for the moment white has the bishop pair. The downside is f3 is weak, and by playing bishop g4, black is threatening to ruin our kingside pawn structure, so knight d4. And there is no way to save ourselves, so we take on e5, bishop f3 and gf3, and let's say d5. This position, our king is unsafe, but black's king isn't too safe either. We don't have the f4 square, so we should do something about that straight away. Just get rid of this bind and trade off the pawn. It should be equal, completely equal, but only if black takes on f4. If black does something else, then it's already slightly problematic. So I think black should just take the pawn on f4, and after bishop f4, it's 2 bishops versus 2 knights. The engine says equal, but I think it's very easy for black to go wrong. There are so many dangerous things that could happen with this bishop pair. It doesn't necessarily have to be a kingside attack. It can simply be something dropping on the queen side. So that's the transposition to the bishop's opening. Again, a couple of options for black, either snapping the bishop off straight away or not, by playing bishop c5. If I had black, I'd go bishop c5. I think that's the most interesting way to go about this. Sorry if you can hear my dog and my fiance, they are here and doing stuff. Okay, the third move I would like to look at is the so-called reverse Spanish. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. This is the same thing in reverse. Again, you don't see in this position, you don't see the move bishop c5 too often. It's been played about 2,000 times and it's okay, but it's, you know, not common. And that's the position we get here, although white is a tempo up compared to black in that position. I should say that knight d5, even though it looks tempting, doesn't give white anything. If knight d5 trying to punish this bishop, then simply knight d5, bishop d5, and c6. And white has lost too much time and black can go d5, and black is equal or more than equal. If c3, then bishop c5. And we basically get a fairly symmetrical position. So c3, bishop c5, ed, cd, something like knight f3, e4, d4 should be more than fine for black. I don't think white should go for this. So after bishop b4, I think white should simply go knight f3. You switch plans to a normal Spanish. You're playing the Spanish a tempo up, so why not? You have the black pieces in the Spanish and you get an extra move. So I'm not gonna talk about this too much. Black should probably castle or take on c3. I should say that taking on e4 fails, and this is a pattern you probably should know from the Spanish. Black isn't winning a pawn, so white wasn't forced to go d3 on the previous move. If this is taken and knight takes e4, white just wins with queen d5. And it's a double attack on the knight and on the f7 pawn, therefore knight d6 is forced, but now queen takes e5, and this should be overwhelming for white. The engine says +2 after something like queen e7, king e7, and bishop d5. And of course, white has the bishop pair, white has a lead in development, this knight is awkward, this king is awkward, so white can safely go knight f3. This pawn on e4 cannot be taken. So black castles, normal Spanish stuff. White castles, normal Spanish stuff. d6, d3, and in this position, black could choose to take, and normally black will take, and we will get something like this. Bishop c3, bc3, bishop e6, bishop b3, knight bd7. And again, these two squares are important. These two pawn breaks are important. Other than that, everything is symmetrical, but white has double c pawns and the bishop pair. So long term, I think white should be better. I don't believe in this idea of going bishop b4 against the Stanley variation in the Vienna. It's just a Spanish tempo down, and you cannot hope to equalize. I think white is always slightly better. Okay, I saved the best for last. Bishop c5, the Spielmann attack. This can lead to something absolutely crazy. Okay, so when I was studying this, the first thing I noticed was that black either plays for d5 or d6. And black's next move is crucial. If d6 is played, we can expect a normal, safe game. Okay, unless white wishes to go f4 straight away and then transpose to some other lines we were looking at, if black plays knight c6. Otherwise, after f4, it's going to be a position in which white is attacking. So we're going to be looking at this in a moment. Alternatively, and more interestingly, black can go c6. Okay, this is something we should be afraid of. And c6 prepares d5. d5 blocks this bishop. Okay, the knight isn't pinned. The bishop is on c5, not on b4. But still, black has enough defenders. And if you go knight f3 here, which is normal, and avoid playing for an advantage, then the position is tame. Let's say d6, castles, castles, bishop b3, knight bd7. We could say knight e2, for example, bishop b6, c3. This you will see in many Spanish and Italian positions, in many bishops openings, in many 3 knights, 4 knights. This is going to be very familiar territory to you e4, e5 players. The knight is on f3, and that's just a fairly standard position. However, if white wants to fight for an advantage, white has to play the move f4, and we are going into some crazy lines now. So white is opening up the king side, so black counterattacks with d5. And after e takes d5, black doesn't take. Black plays the move knight g4. And this is a crazy rook sacrifice line, which, if you know everything, leads to a forced draw. Now, I was studying one game, which I believe was a correspondence game, which was perfect engine play. So all of this is engine approved. But if you learn this and get it over the board, your opponent isn't going to know everything. So, you know, you're probably going to win with either side. So black threatens to play knight f2. And we allow that. We go knight f3. Okay, black castles. We go fe5, and black goes knight f2. Now we are going to lose the rook. That much is clear. Okay, we are going to lose the rook. So we go queen e2. Not threatening to take the knight, but the knight still takes on h1. Okay, then we continue bishop g5. A rapid development and 2 central pawns in exchange for a rook. Okay, the queen goes to a5. Looking at our knight on c3, we go d6. Now we have a passed pawn on d6. Black goes bishop g4. We go bishop e7, attacking the rook. And they don't move the rook, they go bishop a3. This is the unbelievable engine move that I couldn't find myself. So the idea is, of course, bishop b2 and queen c3, or bishop c3. So, according to the engine, white takes on f8, black takes on b2, white goes e6, okay, believe it or not, bishop c3 check, king f1, and now bishop takes e6. And this should be equal after bishop takes, not taking the bishop here, but taking on a1, bishop takes f7, king f7, queen e7 check, king g8, and bishop g7. Now, of course, we're threatening mate, so bishop takes is forced, and now you get a repetition. Queen e6 check, and of course, king f8 is forced. If king h8, then this is a mate in 2. And after king f8, we get a repetition like this. So, after f4, you have to be prepared for that. d5, e takes d5, knight g4. You have no way to save yourself. If in this position you go knight h3, black is just winning after queen h4. And if g3, you lose the knight. So you cannot go knight h3. You have to go knight f3, and you have to accept knight f2 eventually coming. So that's extremely sharp and extremely crazy. So if black plays c6, I think this is the best black can do against the Stanley variation of the Vienna. White should go f4. Again, as I said, if white goes knight f3, it's just equal. So if you do try f4, be prepared. d5 takes knight g4. And again, you can find this entire line and you can get quizzed on it if you follow the links in the description. So it's just going to make studying all of that much easier. I should also say that if d3, black is also able to play knight c6, which transposes to chapter 2 of what we were looking at, the 3 knights variation. Okay, now let's have a brief look at d6. This avoids all the crazy stuff with f4, although f4 is still possible. You can now go knight a4, pick up the bishop, or you can go f4. let's look at f4 first because it's crazy. Now, one thing I should say is that knight g4 doesn't really work. On knight g4, we don't have a knight on f3 yet. So we have the idea of going queen h5. And look at this. We go f5. Now, this move may seem mysterious, but this is setting up a trap. It's setting up queen h5 and bishop e6. Okay, so if there's a queen on h5, that means that, and the king is on e8, that means that f e6 isn't possible, the pawn is pinned. So bishop e6 will attack any queen on d7 that's trying to defend f7. Therefore, after white plays f5, if black plays knight f2 going for the rook, black is completely losing. We go queen h5 and there is no defense. There is no defense. Queen d7 is the only move if, queen d7 is bad. So is queen e7, so is g6, everything is bad. If this happens, then fg6, queen h6, and we're coming in. If knight takes h1, for example, then we have knight d5 ideas, and all of our pieces are just going to overwhelm black. Let's say c6, bishop g5. You can see that this is too much. The best move for black is in fact queen takes g5, and white should be winning. After queen h5, though, if they play in a seemingly more sensible way with queen d7, then bishop e6, and it's game over. Bishop e6, queen e7, knight d5, no squares for the queen. That's it. G6. We don't trade queens, of course. We go queen h6, and now after something like queen f8, we can simply take on c8, and we are up material, and we have a much better king. We're threatening bishop b7. Black resigns. So if d6 and f4, I don't think black can get away with knight g4. Just remember to go f5, and the knight will have to go back. If knight g4, f5, and the best move is knight f6. So black just lost 2 tempi. Other than that, black's best is knight c6, and this just doesn't fall into the trap. We go knight f3, and now bishop g4. That's fine. a6 is also possible. Knight a4, getting the bishop, bishop b6, knight b6, a b6 should be about equal. Let's say c3, castles, castles. I think it's more pleasant for white because, of course, we have the bishop pair and we have the semi-open f-file, but it's okay for black. And finally, after d6, if we don't go f4 into all of that craziness, which I think you should, you can just aim to go knight a4 straight away. And after bishop b6, takes, knight e2, we're gonna go f4, let's say bishop e6, takes, pawn takes, castles, f4, should be about equal. You don't have to play f4, you can play f3, it has been played before. It should be about equal, should be equal. So if you want to neutralize the Spielmann attack and avoid all tricks, then just go knight a4, take the dark squared bishop and play on from there. Okay, this was the Stanley variation of the Vienna. I think this is so far the most interesting one. It's extremely sharp and it can be extremely tactical, and either side could lose in a matter of moves. So I think both sides should know this. Thank you very much for watching. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.